He thought no one in the room understood him, and that was exactly how he liked it. The restaurant glowed in soft amber light, polished marble floors reflecting crystal glasses, and tailored suits worth more than most people made in a year. And at the center of it all sat Vincent Moretti, silent, still, and completely in control, his presence heavier than the air itself as conversations lowered without him saying a word, as if the room understood instinctively that everything revolved around him. And tonight was no different, except for one thing: the subtle tension coiled beneath the elegance, the kind that didn't come from business but from something more dangerous: uncertainty. Because Vincent had switched languages without warning, his voice flowing into rapid, flawless Italian, sharp and precise like a blade wrapped in velvet. And suddenly the table of powerful men around him faltered, their confident expressions cracking just enough to reveal hesitation, confusion flickering behind carefully maintained composure. One of them attempting to respond, his accent stiff, his phrasing slightly off, and Vincent didn't interrupt, didn't raise his voice, didn't even react. He simply listened, eyes cold, calculating, letting the mistake linger in the air long enough for everyone to feel it, to understand that something small had just shifted into something much larger. Because in Vincent's world, misunderstanding wasn't harmless, it was weakness. And weakness had consequences no one in that room wanted to face. Not tonight, not in front of him, and across the polished floor, moving quietly between tables. Amara Johnson carried a tray of untouched glasses, her steps measured, her gaze lowered just enough to remain invisible. Just another waitress in a place where people like her were expected to blend into the background, unnoticed, unimportant, but her ears caught every word, every tone, every subtle change in rhythm. Because invisibility didn't mean ignorance. It meant observation, and as Vincent continued speaking, testing, pushing, she felt it, too. That slight fracture in the conversation, the moment where meaning bent just enough to become dangerous, her fingers tightening slightly around the tray as she passed behind them. Because she understood what the others did not, the exact weight of the words being spoken, the difference between a command and a suggestion, between control and chaos. And for a brief second, her breath slowed, her mind sharpening with a clarity that came from years of listening when no one thought she was paying attention, years of surviving by knowing more than she let on. And still, she kept walking, because stepping into a world like this wasn't just risky, it was unthinkable. Yet something in Vincent's tone shifted again, quieter now, more deliberate, and the man across from him responded incorrectly once more, a single word misplaced. But this time the silence that followed was heavier, thicker, like the room itself was holding its breath. And Vincent finally looked up, not at the man who spoke, but past him, scanning the space with a precision that missed nothing. And for the first time that night, his gaze brushed past Amara, just for a second, just enough to make her still, her heart catching in her chest. Because something had changed, something irreversible had just begun, and neither of them knew yet how much it would cost. Amara kept walking, but her mind did not move with her body. It stayed at that table, replaying every word Vincent had spoken, every subtle shift in tone that the others had missed, because what they heard as a test of language, she heard as something else entirely, a calibration of loyalty, a quiet measurement of who deserved to remain close and who did not. And the man who had answered him wrong did not even realize how much he had revealed, not just ignorance, but hesitation. And in a world like Vincent's, hesitation was louder than any confession. The tray in her hands felt heavier now, though it carried nothing, her fingers steady but her pulse uneven, because she knew something the others did not. She knew that Vincent had not made a mistake in switching languages. He had done it on purpose, and that meant he was waiting, not for a translation, but for truth. And truth rarely came from the people sitting at his table. It came from the spaces around it, from the ones no one bothered to see. And still, she said nothing, because survival had taught her that knowing when to stay silent mattered more than knowing when to speak. She reached the service station near the back wall, placing the empty tray down with careful precision, her reflection catching briefly in the polished steel, dark eyes focused, thoughtful, not afraid but calculating. Because fear would have made her leave, and she had not left, she stayed, listening, learning, waiting, and behind her, Vincent's voice continued, quieter now, each word more deliberate, as if he was narrowing the room down to its essentials, stripping away noise until only what mattered remained. Another man attempted to answer him, slower this time, choosing his words carefully, but still wrong, still just slightly off, and the silence that followed stretched longer, thicker, until even the soft music in the background seemed distant, irrelevant. Vincent did not correct him. He did not need to. The absence of approval was enough. And then, without raising his voice, without changing his posture, he spoke again. A single sentence in Italian that carried a weight none of them fully understood. But Amara did. She understood it completely, and her breath caught, not from fear, but from recognition, because that sentence was not a question, it was a decision, and it had just been misunderstood again. Her hand tightened slightly against the counter, a small movement no one noticed, because no one was looking at her. They never were. But this time, staying silent meant allowing something irreversible to unfold, and for a moment, the years folded in on themselves, memories surfacing not as images but as sound, a different room, a different voice speaking the same language with warmth instead of calculation, correcting her gently when she stumbled over a word, teaching her not just how to speak, but how to listen, how to hear intention behind expression, how to understand what was meant even when it was not said directly. And she realized in that instant that what she carried was not just knowledge, it was responsibility, because understanding something others did not place her in a position she had spent years avoiding, a position where silence was no longer neutral. It was a choice, and choices had consequences. She looked back toward the table, just for a second, and this time Vincent was already looking in her direction, not fully, not obviously, but enough to make it clear that he was aware, not of her actions, but of the space she occupied, and something in that awareness felt intentional, as if he was not just testing the men in front of him, but the entire room, waiting for someone, anyone, to step beyond what was expected. And in that suspended moment, Amara understood something else. He already knew they would fail. He had planned for it. The real question was not whether they understood him, but whether anyone else did, and whether that person would be bold enough to speak. The room held its breath again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that pressed against the edges of every movement, every thought, and Amara felt it settle over her, heavy and undeniable, because for the first time since she walked into that restaurant, invisibility was no longer protection, it was a decision she could no longer afford to make. The moment stretched just long enough to become dangerous, not because of what was happening, but because of what was not. No one spoke, no one corrected the mistake, and Vincent did not repeat himself. He simply watched, his silence heavier than any command, and Amara felt it settle into her chest like a weight she could no longer ignore, her fingers slowly releasing the edge of the counter as her mind moved faster than her body, calculating, measuring, understanding exactly how far she was about to step beyond the invisible line that had kept her safe for so long. Because once she spoke, she would no longer be unseen, and being seen in a room like this came with consequences no one ever explained out loud. But still, the words Vincent had used echoed clearly in her mind, not as sound, but as intention. And she knew with absolute certainty that what had just been understood by the men at the table was not what had been said, not even close. It was a distortion, a dangerous one, the kind that did not correct itself. And for a brief second, she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of discipline, because everything in her life had been built on restraint, on knowing when silence was the better choice. But this was different. This was not about being careful. This was about being right. And sometimes those two things did not align. Her breath steadied, her posture unchanged, but something inside her shifted, something quiet but irreversible. And before she could second-guess it, she turned, not fully, not dramatically, just enough to step back into the space she had been avoiding, her voice entering the room not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that cut through everything else, precise, measured, unmistakably fluent as she spoke in Italian, correcting the sentence with exact phrasing, restoring the meaning Vincent had intended without adding or taking anything away, and the effect was immediate, not explosive, not chaotic, but absolute. Conversations stopped mid-thought, movements paused without instruction, and even the subtle clink of glass against table faded into nothing as the room recalibrated around a reality no one had anticipated, because the voice they heard did not match the person they saw. And for a moment, that disconnect was enough to silence everyone. Vincent did not react instantly. He did not need to. The stillness around him was response enough. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he shifted his gaze fully toward her, not past her, not through her, but directly at her. And the weight of that attention was unlike anything Amara had felt before, not hostile, not impressed, but focused, as if he was aligning something in his mind that had just come into view. His expression did not change, but the air did, tightening in a way that made every person in the room aware that something had just altered the balance they all relied on. And when he finally spoke again, it was still in Italian, still controlled, but now directed at her, not as a test for the table, but as a question meant for one person only, his tone slightly faster, the phrasing more complex, layered with nuance that would have confused anyone who only understood the surface of the language. But Amara did not hesitate. She answered with the same calm precision, matching his pace, his structure, even the subtle inflection that carried meaning beyond the words themselves. And in that exchange, brief as it was, something undeniable took shape, not spoken, not acknowledged, but present, because for the first time that night, Vincent was no longer measuring the room. He was measuring her, and the room knew it. Even if they did not understand the language, they understood the shift, the way attention had narrowed, the way importance had moved, and no one dared to interrupt it, because in that silence, something far more significant than conversation was happening, something that would not be undone once it was complete. Vincent did not look away after she finished speaking, not even for a second, and that was what made the room uneasy, not the language they could not understand, but the attention they could clearly see, because men like him did not give focus without reason, and certainly not to someone who, just moments ago, had been invisible. Yet now every detail about Amara seemed to stand out in a way that made no sense to anyone watching. Her posture still composed, her hands steady at her sides, but her presence no longer blended into the background. It held shape, weight, and something else they could not name. Vincent leaned back slightly in his chair, not in relaxation, but in recalibration, as if adjusting to a new variable that had not been part of his expectations, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, tapping once, a subtle signal that caused the man beside him to fall completely silent, even though no one had spoken, because silence, in that moment, was no longer empty. It was full of recognition, and Vincent spoke again, still in Italian, slower this time, not simplifying his words, but allowing space between them, as if observing how she would respond, and Amara understood exactly what he was doing. This was no longer correction. This was confirmation. He was testing the depth of what she knew, not just whether she understood, but how far that understanding reached. And she answered again, just as precisely, her tone calm, respectful, but unwavering, matching his pace without hesitation, and with each exchange, something became clearer to everyone in the room. Even those who could not follow a single word, the power dynamic had shifted, not dramatically, not with noise or force, but with quiet certainty, the kind that could not be argued with because it was not announced, it was demonstrated. Vincent's gaze sharpened slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, as if refining his perception of her. And then, without warning, he switched to English, his voice lower now, directed only at her, asking a simple question that carried more weight than it appeared. Where did you learn that? And for the first time since she spoke, Amara paused, not because she did not know the answer, but because she understood the implication behind the question. This was not curiosity. It was classification. He was placing her, defining where she belonged in his understanding of the world, and she chose her words carefully, not to impress, but to remain truthful without revealing more than necessary. She said she had lived with someone who spoke it every day, someone who believed language should be felt, not memorized, and Vincent held her gaze for a moment longer, measuring not just her answer, but the restraint within it, because she had given him enough to satisfy the question, but not enough to expose herself completely, and that, more than anything, seemed to interest him. The man who had spoken incorrectly earlier shifted slightly in his seat, clearly aware that the attention had moved away from him, but unable to reclaim it, because nothing he could say now would matter, not after what had just happened, and Vincent did not look back at him, not even once, as if that part of the room had already lost relevance. Instead, he stood, slowly, deliberately, and the movement alone caused everyone nearby to straighten instinctively. But he did not address the table, he did not give instructions or corrections. He simply adjusted his jacket and stepped away, his focus still fixed on Amara, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but it carried across the room with unmistakable clarity. Finish your shift, then come find me. And with that, he turned and walked toward the private hallway, leaving behind a silence that was no longer about confusion, but about realization, because in that single moment, without raising his voice, without making a scene, he had redrawn the boundaries of the room, and everyone there knew it, even if they did not understand how or why, and Amara remained where she was, not moving immediately, not reacting outwardly, but inside, she felt the shift fully settle, because the line she had crossed could not be stepped back over, and whatever came next would not be something she could simply walk away from. Amara did not move for several seconds after he left, not because she was frozen, but because she understood that movement now meant something different. Every step she took would be seen, measured, interpreted in ways it never had before, and the weight of that awareness settled quietly over her shoulders as the room around her slowly came back to life. Conversations resuming in low, uncertain tones, chairs shifting, glasses clinking, but none of it sounded the same, not after what they had just witnessed, because even without understanding the words, they had understood the outcome. Attention had been given, and attention from a man like Vincent Moretti was not casual. It was intentional, deliberate, and irreversible. One of the men at the table glanced in her direction, then quickly looked away, as if unsure how to place her now, no longer just staff, but not something he could define either. And that uncertainty spread quietly across the room, subtle but undeniable, while Amara reached for another tray, her movements returning to routine with practiced precision, because routine was the only thing that still felt stable, the only thing that reminded her she still had control over something. Even if everything else had shifted beyond her reach, she continued serving, refilling glasses, clearing plates, responding to polite requests with the same calm tone she had always used, but inside, her thoughts were moving in a different direction entirely, replaying Vincent's words, not the ones he had spoken aloud, but the ones implied. Beneath them, finish your shift, then come find me. It was not a suggestion, not an invitation, it was a continuation, and she knew that whatever waited at the end of that sentence would not be simple, not something she could navigate with the same quiet invisibility she had relied on until now. Time moved differently after that, slower in some ways, faster in others, each minute stretching just enough for her to feel it pass, each task becoming a marker of how close she was getting to something unknown. And yet, she did not rush, she did not falter, because if there was one thing she had learned, it was that composure was not about hiding fear, it was about not letting it dictate your actions. And by the time her shift began to wind down, the restaurant had returned to its usual rhythm, the earlier tension dissolving into the background like it had never been there. Except it had, and the people who mattered knew it. The manager approached her briefly, his expression careful, almost cautious, asking if everything was all right, if she needed to step away, but she shook her head lightly, offering a simple reassurance that required no further explanation, because explanations were not what this moment called for. It called for clarity, and clarity came from moving forward, not stepping back. She untied her apron in the staff room, folding it neatly as she always did, placing it in the same locker she had used for months. But even that familiar motion felt different now, as if it marked the end of something more than just a shift. She paused for a moment, looking at her reflection again, the same face, the same steady gaze. But there was something else there now, something sharper, more defined, not because she had changed, but because she had been seen, truly seen. And once that happened, there was no returning to what came before. She took a breath, slow and controlled, then stepped out of the staff corridor and toward the private hallway Vincent had disappeared into earlier, the lighting there dimmer, quieter, removed from the polished noise of the main floor, each step measured, deliberate, not hesitant, but aware, because she understood that whatever waited ahead was not just a conversation, it was a threshold, and crossing it would mean stepping into a space where she would no longer be defined by what others assumed she was, but by what she had already proven herself to be. And as she reached the end of the hallway, she saw the door slightly ajar, a subtle indication that she was expected, not invited, and without knocking, without announcing herself, she pushed it open just enough to step inside, her presence quiet but unmistakable, because this time, invisibility was no longer part of who she was. The room inside was quieter than anything she had left behind, not silent, but controlled, the kind of stillness that did not need to announce itself to be felt. And Vincent Moretti stood near the window, his back partially turned, city lights stretching beyond the glass in clean lines of gold and white, reflecting faintly against the polished surface beside him. He did not react immediately when she entered, as if her arrival had already been accounted for, expected down to the second, and Amara closed the door gently behind her, the soft click settling into the space like a final boundary between what had been and what was about to begin. She did not step forward right away, not out of hesitation, but because she understood the rhythm of this moment. It was not hers to control, not yet, and Vincent finally turned, slow, deliberate, his gaze landing on her with the same measured intensity as before. But now there was no distraction, no audience, just focus, undiluted and precise. He studied her without speaking, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt exact, as if he was aligning everything he had observed into something clearer, something more defined. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been at the table, but no less controlled. He asked her to repeat what she had said earlier, not in English, but in Italian, the exact sentence, the exact correction. And Amara did not question it. She responded immediately, her voice steady, her pronunciation unchanged, not performing, not emphasizing, simply stating it as it was meant to be said. And Vincent listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. And when she finished, the silence that followed was not empty. It was evaluative, deliberate, as if something was being confirmed rather than discovered. He took a step closer, not abruptly, not in a way that closed distance aggressively, but enough to shift the space between them into something more intentional. And he spoke again, this time asking her a different question, still in Italian, but more complex, layered with phrasing that required more than familiarity. It required understanding, nuance, and she answered again, just as clearly, not faster, not slower, matching his cadence with quiet precision. And for a brief moment, something shifted in his expression, subtle, almost imperceptible, but present, not surprise, not disbelief, but recognition, as if what he had suspected was now confirmed beyond doubt. And he switched back to English, his tone unchanged, but the question different. Why did you not speak sooner? And Amara held his gaze, not defiant, not submissive, simply steady, because this was not a question about language. It was a question about choice, and she answered honestly, saying that speaking too soon would have made it seem like she was trying to prove something. And she was not. She only spoke when it mattered, when silence would have caused more harm than good. And Vincent remained still for a moment after she finished, absorbing not just her words, but the reasoning behind them, because in that answer was something more valuable than skill. It was judgment, restraint, the ability to measure a moment before acting. And that was not something easily taught. He nodded once, a small, controlled acknowledgement, and then walked past her, not dismissing her, but repositioning himself, creating space in a way that shifted the dynamic again. And when he spoke next, his voice carried a different weight, not testing, not questioning, but deciding. He said that people at his table had spent years trying to understand him, learning words, memorizing phrases, yet they still listened without hearing. And then he paused, just long enough for the meaning to settle, before adding that she had done the opposite. She had listened first, and only spoke when it counted. And that, he said quietly, was rare. The room held that statement in silence, not dramatic, not heavy, but clear, because what he was saying was not praise, it was recognition, and recognition from someone like him was not given lightly. He turned back toward her, his gaze steady, and asked her one final question, not about where she learned, Not about what she knew, but whether she understood what came with being seen, not just noticed, but placed into a different category entirely. And Amara did not answer immediately, because she understood that this was the real threshold, not the language, not the correction, but the consequence of it. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, certain. She said that being seen meant being responsible for what you could no longer pretend not to know, and Vincent watched her for a second longer, then nodded again, slower this time, as if something had just aligned exactly where it needed to be. And in that moment, without any formal declaration, without any raised voice or visible shift, the terms between them changed, and neither of them needed to say it out loud for it to be understood. Vincent did not speak again right away after that answer, and somehow that silence felt more decisive than anything he could have said, because it was no longer about testing or questioning. It was about what he chose to do next, and Amara understood that without needing it explained. The air in the room remained still, but not tense, not uncertain. Instead, it carried a quiet clarity, the kind that comes when something has been settled without argument. Vincent moved toward the desk near the far wall, his steps unhurried, controlled, as if nothing about this moment required urgency, and yet everything about it mattered. He rested his hand lightly against the surface, not leaning, not relaxing, simply grounding the space, then glanced at her again, not to reassess, but to confirm that she was still exactly where he expected her to be, composed, attentive, present. And when he spoke, his voice had shifted again, not softer, not warmer, but more direct. He said that people often believe power came from being the loudest in the room, from speaking first, from controlling every conversation, but that was never how it truly worked. Real power, he said, came from knowing when not to speak, from understanding a moment before anyone else realized it mattered. And as he spoke, it was clear that he was not teaching her something new. He was naming something she already understood, placing words on a principle she had been living by without needing to define it. And that recognition changed the dynamic in a way that neither of them acknowledged openly, because it did not need acknowledgement to exist. He stepped away from the desk and closed the distance between them slightly, not enough to invade her space, but enough to make the conversation more focused, more intentional. And then he said something that shifted everything again. He said that the people who sat at his table earlier would forget what happened tonight by morning. They would convince themselves. It was nothing, a small interruption, an anomaly, because that was easier than accepting what it meant. But he would not forget, and neither would she. And that difference, he explained, was what separated those who reacted from those who understood. Amara listened without interrupting, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, but inside, she felt the weight of what he was saying settle deeper. Because this was not just observation, it was expectation, and expectations like that were never casual. Vincent paused for a moment, just long enough to let that thought settle fully, then continued, saying that from this point forward, she had a choice. Not one he was going to force, not one that required an immediate answer, but a choice that would define how she moved through the world after tonight. She could return to the floor, continue as she had before, remain unseen, let this moment exist as something isolated, something that did not alter the course of her life, or she could accept what had already changed, step into a space where her awareness, her judgment, her ability to listen and understand were no longer incidental, but essential, and he made it clear without stating it directly that stepping into that space would come with responsibility, with visibility, with consequences she would not be able to ignore. The room held that choice between them, not as pressure, but as reality, and Vincent watched her not for her answer, but for her reaction, because he already knew that the words themselves were not what mattered. It was whether she understood the weight behind them. Amara took a slow breath, not to steady herself, but to acknowledge the moment for what it was, because there was no pretending now, no stepping back into the safety of not knowing. And she realized that what he was offering was not opportunity in the way most people would define it. It was alignment, a recognition of something that already existed, and whether she accepted it or not, it would not disappear. It would simply remain, waiting, shaping everything that came after. She lifted her gaze slightly, meeting his without hesitation, not with defiance, not with submission, but with clarity. because that was the only response that made sense in a moment like this. And though she had not spoken yet, the room felt different again, as if the answer had already begun to take form, not in words, but in understanding, and Vincent seemed to recognize that, because he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, as if to say that whatever came next would not be decided by him alone, but by the way she chose to carry what she now knew. And in that quiet exchange, something settled into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of certainty that did not need to be announced to be real. Amara did not rush to answer, and that alone seemed to confirm more than words ever could, because Vincent was not watching for agreement. He was watching for understanding, and understanding did not come quickly. It settled, it formed, it revealed itself in the way a person chose to stand inside a moment like this. She remained still, her gaze steady, not searching for the right response, but recognizing that there was no simple one, because what he had placed in front of her was not a decision between two paths. It was an acknowledgement that the path had already shifted beneath her feet, and whether she stepped forward or stepped back, she would not return to where she had been before. The silence stretched just enough to make that truth unmistakable, and Vincent did not interrupt it. He allowed it, because he understood that forcing an answer too soon would diminish its value. And when Amara finally spoke, her voice was calm, grounded. She said that she did not believe in pretending not to see what was already clear, and that once something was understood, it could not be undone, only ignored, and she had never been good at ignoring what mattered. Vincent listened without reaction at first, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a slight narrowing of focus that suggested her answer had landed exactly where it needed to, not because it was impressive, but because it was honest, and honesty, in a room built on calculation, was rare enough to stand out without effort. He nodded once, slower than before, not as approval, but as alignment, as if something between them had moved into place without needing further explanation. Then he turned slightly, gesturing toward the chair across from the desk, not as a command, but as an invitation that carried weight, and Amara understood the difference. She stepped forward and sat, not hesitantly, not cautiously, but with the same measured control she had maintained from the beginning. Because sitting did not lower her position, it defined it, and Vincent remained standing for a moment longer before taking his own seat, the space between them now deliberate, structured, no longer undefined. And when he spoke again, his tone had shifted in a way that made the conversation feel less like a test and more like a transition. He said that most people who entered his world did so loudly, announcing themselves, demanding to be seen. But they rarely understood what being seen actually required. They saw it as access, as advantage, as power, but they failed to recognize the responsibility that came with it, the constant awareness, the inability to step back into ignorance once certain things became clear. And he paused briefly, letting that settle, before continuing, saying that she had entered that space differently, not by demanding attention, but by earning it without trying. And that difference mattered more than anything she could have claimed about herself. Amara listened carefully, not absorbing the words as praise, but as information, because she understood that everything he said had purpose. It was not about acknowledging her. It was about defining the terms of what came next. And Vincent leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, as he explained that if she chose to step forward, truly step forward, then her role would no longer be limited to what others assumed it was. She would be expected to listen, to observe, to recognize patterns others missed, to speak when it mattered and remain silent when it did not as a performance, but as a function, a necessity. And he made it clear that this was not something he would teach her from the beginning, because she had already demonstrated that she understood the foundation. What remained was whether she was willing to carry it consistently, without recognition, without reassurance. And that was where most people failed. The room held that statement quietly, not heavy, but exact, because it stripped away any illusion about what this path would offer. And in that clarity, Amara felt something settle within her, not pressure, not fear, but certainty, because for the first time, the question was not whether she was capable, but whether she was willing, and she realized that the answer had already been forming long before she walked into this room, long before she spoke at that table. It had been forming in every moment she chose to listen instead of react, to understand instead of assume, and now, standing at the edge of that realization, she understood that stepping forward was not about changing who she was, it was about accepting it fully, without hesitation, and Vincent watched her in that moment, not waiting, not pushing, simply observing, because he already knew that. Whatever she decided would not be based on impulse, but on something far more deliberate, something that would define everything that followed. And in that quiet, measured space, the decision was no longer something that needed to be spoken immediately. It was something that had already begun to take shape in the way she held herself, in the way she met his gaze without uncertainty, and in the way the room itself seemed to recognize that whatever came next would not be a continuation of what had been, but the beginning of something entirely different. Vincent did not interrupt her thoughts, did not rush the moment, because he understood something most people did not, that the most important decisions were not made out loud. They were made in silence, in the space where a person either stepped forward into clarity or retreated into comfort. And as he watched Amara, he could already see which direction she was moving, not because she said it, but because of how she held herself. The steadiness in her posture, the absence of hesitation in her gaze, the quiet certainty that had replaced any trace of doubt. And that was when he leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk, not as a gesture of pressure, but as a signal that the moment had reached its conclusion. He said that there would be no announcement, no formal change, nothing that would draw attention from those who were not meant to understand, because the people who needed to know would recognize it without explanation, and those who did not would continue as they always had, unaware of what had shifted right in front of them. And that was exactly how it needed to be. Amara listened, absorbing the weight of that decision, because it meant that everything would change without appearing to change, that she would return to the same floor, the same role, the same uniform, but nothing about it would be the same, not anymore. Vincent continued, explaining that from this point forward, she would not be called when something was obvious. She would be present when something was not, when conversations carried more than what was spoken, when decisions were being shaped beneath the surface. And her role would be to hear what others missed, to understand what others overlooked, and to act only when it mattered, not before, not after, but exactly in the moment where silence would no longer serve the truth. And as he spoke, there was no sense of elevation in his tone, no suggestion that he was offering her something rare or extraordinary, because to him, this was not a gift, it was a recognition of what already existed, something he had simply chosen to acknowledge. He stood again, slowly, the movement marking the end of the conversation without needing to declare it, and for a brief moment, the room returned to stillness, the kind that comes just before everything resumes, but never quite the same as before. Amara rose as well, not because she was instructed to, but because she understood the rhythm of the moment, and when she did, Vincent looked at her one last time, not as a test, not as an evaluation, but as a confirmation, and he said quietly that from now on, she would not need to prove anything, not to him, not to anyone, because what mattered had already been seen, and once something was seen clearly, it did not need to be repeated to remain true. The words settled between them, not heavy, not dramatic, but final in a way that did not require emphasis, and Amara nodded once, a small, controlled acknowledgement that carried more weight than agreement, because it was not about accepting his terms, it was about recognizing her own, and without another word, she turned and walked toward the door, her steps measured, unchanged on the surface, but entirely different in meaning, because each step now carried awareness, intention, and something else she could not yet fully define. But she knew it would reveal itself in time. She opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, the dim lighting greeting her with the same quiet familiarity as before, but it no longer felt like a place of transition. It felt like a space she now understood more clearly. And as she made her way back toward the main floor, the sounds of the restaurant returning gradually, she realized something that had not been spoken, but had become undeniable. Nothing about her world had expanded outward. Nothing had changed in appearance, but everything within it had shifted in alignment. And that was where real change lived, not in what others could see, but in what they could no longer ignore. She stepped back onto the floor, the same uniform, the same role, the same movement between tables,